One square. All Alireza Firouzja needs to fight against Super Grandmaster Alexander Grischuk is one square. Almost everything that happens on the board is focused on that single square. This game was played with Alireza Firouzja against Alexander Grischuk. It's a blitz game in St. Louis. It's the Vienna opening. Let's jump right in. Firouzja plays e4, e5, knight to c3. We have the Vienna on the board. Knight f6, bishop to c4. Knight c6, d3, bishop to b4. And the main move here is knight g to e2, and Alireza has played this before, but in this position he plays bishop to d2. Firouzja always seems to play something a little different each time to keep his opponent from, keeping them having to guess. He's never a stationary target. He always plays something different. Bishop takes. Grischuk voluntarily gives up the two bishops for free and easy development with the move d5. Pawn takes, knight d5. Knight f3, castles, and Grischuk decides not to grab the two bishops. He likes his knight where it's at on d5 and wants to leave it there. It's centralized. Bishop g4, h3, bishop h5, rook to e1. So now we have our focus, our single square focus. And as this game progresses, it's really phenomenal how much this game is built around this e5 pawn and e5 square for both sides. Very educational. There are 64 squares on the board, but it's the one square that really matters here. Rook to e8 defends the pawn. Queen to e2 adds another attacker. Queen to d6 defends. Queen to e4 hits the knight at d5. It's got to move. Knight to f6. And now queen to f5. What he's doing is getting the queen out of the way of black's rook at e8. This is the only real mistake Firouzja makes in the game. It turns out that Grischuk had a chance to get the advantage here with the move g6. And after queen to g5, bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop. Firouzja would have lost an attacker of the e5 square, and his kingside pawns would have been ruined. And Grischuk would have had the advantage in this case, but that was his chance. Bishop takes f3 now, and he can retake with the queen, and his kingside pawns stay healthy. Rook e7, rook e3, building up the attack on the e5 pawn. Firouzja could potentially play bishop to b5 and exchange off this c6 knight. So Grischuk plays a6. That's right, a move on the side of the board, way on the other side of the board, is actually played to defend a pawn in the center of the board. Everything is built around the e5 pawn and the e5 square, stopping bishop to b5. Rook a to e1, doubling against the pawn, doubling in its defense. Everything's built around it. These two rooks, this bishop, are attacking. The knight, queen, and both rooks are defending. a4 gaining space, stopping b5 if black ever wanted to play that. h6, and now g3. And I'm not really sure about this move. I think this was sort of a move for the clock. You know, it was a sort of a standstill in the middle of the board, but he wanted to make a move, and so Firouzja plays g3 here. a5, and this turns out to be a strategic mistake because what we've already just said, it gives the b5 square away, and now Alireza is able to play bishop to b5 and pin that knight. The rook goes back to e2. The knight cannot yet jump into d4 because the b7 pawn would fall, so he plays b6, so the knight can move. Unfortunately, because he played a5 earlier, boom, bishop to b5. The knight is pinned to the rook, and the queen and the bishop threaten to just take it. It's attacked twice and only defended once, so Grischuk is now in big trouble. He plays knight to d5 to block the queen, but after bishop takes knight, removing a defender of e5, queen takes c6, and now rook takes e5. Firouzja has won the e5 pawn and now has a clear advantage. Now his endgame skills come to the table. Rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, bishop takes. And Firouzja has a pawn-up endgame, and it's queen and knight versus queen and bishop. The only thing in Grischuk's favor here is that the queen and knight tend to be a better combination than the queen and the bishop. The reason is that the queen already does things that the bishop can do, whereas the knight is unique, and the queen cannot do what the knight can do. So he has a chance with the queen and knight maybe to save the position. Queen e6, queen e4, f6, kicks the bishop away, bishop f4, king to f7, trying to get the king closer. Grischuk just takes the queen, then pawn takes, knight takes, gf4, and this should be an easily winning endgame. Grischuk plays king to f7, wants to activate the king. c4, Firouzja forces the knight to make a decision. Queen takes queen first, pawn takes, knight f4, and he has no choice. Otherwise, he's just going to lose the c7 pawn, and the rest of the pawns on the queen side would be in big trouble. Knight f4, pawn takes. So here we are in a king and pawn endgame, and Firouzja is up 1 pawn. And still, the e5 square is the pawn break that would give him a passed pawn. So the square is still the central issue in the position. King to e6, they centralize their kings. King to c5, king to g4. Now, it looks like Grischuk could actually just take on c4 and restore the material balance, but that does not work. If he takes on c4, then e5, we're familiar with this square, aren't we? Pawn takes, king d5, king f5, f4, or c6, f4, and this position is just winning for Firouzja. After b5, he plays king to g6, threatening to come to f7, and then the pawn would just be escorted to the queening square. It would not be stoppable. So if king to e6, he would just take the pawn. And the threat is to just come back to g6 and then escort this pawn up the board. And if he plays this, then king to f7 just allows this pawn. So there would be nothing he could do. So king takes c4 is actually a losing move. So he plays g6 to keep Firouzja's king out of the position to control f5 and h5. But he plays f5 himself. He can't take on f5 because king takes is an easy win. After g5, the move e5 wins. Pawn takes, then king to h5, king to d6, king g6, king e7, king g7. And again, the pawn cannot be stopped. It'll just go to the queening square very easily. So Grischuk plays h5 instead. King f4, g5 check, king to e3. So now Grischuk takes the pawn at c4, equalizing the material. But white is still winning. What move does he play? That square we've been looking at the whole game? That's right, e5, getting those pawns mobilized. Taking the pawn would lose because he just advances, and black could not catch the pawn going to the queening square. So instead, Grischuk plays king to d5, and Firouzja could take on f6. This is still winning, but the easier win is to just play e6. And now you have this protected passed pawn, and he's in big trouble. King to d6. Now you'll see these arrows. That creates a box, and black's king is stuck inside that box. It's from c6 to g6. If he leaves the box, then this pawn will just queen. So his king has to stay close enough to the pawn that he can catch it if it moves. And so he's locked in this box, and Firouzja is going to use that to his advantage to win this endgame. f3, c6, king to d4, king to e7, king to c4, king d6, b4. So what Firouzja is going to do is going to use these 2 pawns to break up these 3 pawns and win them with his own king. Pawn takes, king e7. Now a5, further breaking up those pawns. King a5, king d6, king to b6, h4, and now black has really run out of pawn moves. All he can do is move his king, which is still trapped inside that box. King to a5, king to c7, king to b4. What Firouzja is doing, he's going to triangulate against black's king, using the limited movement of black's king so that his king is placed in an ideal position so that he wins. King c8, king c4. And notice he didn't just play the king here. By playing king to c4, he has what we call opposition. There are 3 squares, an odd number of squares separating his king from black's king, and it is black's move. So Firouzja has the opposition. King to d8, king to d4, keeping the opposition. King to c8, king to c5. He goes in and now he forces it. This was winning anyway, as it turns out. And he gives up the e-pawn, the precious protected passed e-pawn. King to d7, e8, queen, king takes e8. So why did he give up that beautiful piece? Because of this move, king to c6. And again, he has diagonal opposition. 1 square separating the 2 kings. And now he's able to force his way in. King e7, king to c7. And in this position, Alexander Grischuk resigned. But let's see why. The following moves would almost certainly take place. King e8, king d6, king f7. Notice how he's inching his way in, is using his king to dominate black's king. King f8, king e6, king g7, king e7, and then the king would finally be forced away. King g8, king takes f6, and we have an easy win for Alireza Firouzja. 1 square out of 64. Able to beat a Super Grandmaster. Really an amazing game. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.